Well, hi there everybody. Welcome back to Be Like Christ. In today's video, we're going to talk about the historicity of Jesus. There are a lot of religions that don't necessarily need historical events to back up their truth claims. And this is because they're more about ideas than actual physical events that happened in the past. Christianity, however, is not one of those religions. In fact, if the events centered around the life of Jesus can't be backed up historically, then pretty much the whole Christian faith falls apart. If Jesus wasn't a real guy, we got nothing. And if you're talking to somebody who doesn't necessarily ascribe to the Christian faith, but maybe they're interested, really the first thing that you have to do is to establish that Jesus was actually a real person. And this is part of the apologetic debate that has raged for years and years, but is almost settled at this point in history. Although you may hear from some uninformed college professors or maybe your friends or maybe some troll on the internet that there's no historical proof that Jesus ever lived, this debate is pretty much settled among scholars. There are very few scholars who would take up the position that Jesus Christ was not an actual historical figure. That doesn't necessarily mean that they say he did miracles, he rose from the dead, but Jesus as a man, and that's the focus of this video, is pretty settled in real historical fact. However, those facts usually aren't discussed in Bible classes or in sermons or things like that. And so in this video, I want to talk about some of the evidences that Jesus was a real historical figure. And some of those evidences are going to come from the Bible, and some of them are going to come from external sources. The first place I want to encourage you to go is to the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, which are really the biographies of Jesus' life, especially the first three. Don't forget about these or let people undercut them, because historically these Gospels have been proven to be correct over and over and over again. They're really no doubt the most scrutinized historical document in history, and they're always found to be geographically, historically correct. This is also true for the other 23 books of the New Testament. As archaeology and other historical studies progress, what we're finding is that the pages of the Bible give us a clear and accurate picture of what was going on during that time period in history. And you might say, you can't use the Bible to claim that Jesus was an actual historical figure because the Bible's biased and all these people loved him and they created this cult surrounding this man who they just invented in their head and then wrote his life story down in the Gospels. So you think we can't use the Bible to actually prove that Jesus was a real man? All right, I don't agree with you, but for the sake of the discussion, I'll grant you that point. What if I told you, though, that there were many secular writers who wrote about Jesus as a real man, who weren't Christians and weren't subscribers to the doctrine and to the teachings of Christ? If you're at all a student of Roman history, the name Tacitus is probably going to be recognizable to you. Tacitus was one of the greatest Roman historians. He lived from about 55 to 120 AD, and he wrote two books, one called Annals and one called Histories, and they really recorded basically the history from about 14 AD until the turn of the century. And one of the noteworthy points of history at that time was this strange Galilean man who was causing all this uproar back in Judah. And so Tacitus actually writes about this man, Jesus, and he tells us some facts about him. The first fact that he tells us is that Jesus was killed by Pontius Pilate. He says that he was alive during the reign of Caesar Tiberius. He also writes and confirms that Christians get their name from being followers of Christ, and that all of this originated in Palestine, and that eventually their message was taken all the way to Rome. So Tacitus confirms through his writings that Jesus was a real man, and that because of his actions, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire. Another writer, Suetonius, or Suetonius, or however you want to say it, I've heard it pronounced 1,000 different ways, but he was the chief secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. He wrote a book called The 12 Caesars, which is really interesting and gives you a picture into what the Roman emperors were really like, and it's kind of disturbing. But in his writings, he gives us two key facts about Jesus and about the people that followed Jesus. He says, first of all, that all the Christians were kicked out of Rome, expelled. And that's actually a fact that the book of Acts talks about. He also says that these people, these Christians, all got their doctrine from a man back in Palestine named Christ. If you've done a lot of study in Christianity and Christian history, another name that you're probably going to know is Josephus. Josephus was a Jew. He was actually a Levite who was kind of a turncoat on the Jews, and he began to work for the Romans. And he became a historian. And his writings give us some of the key insights into what first century life was like. And he writes about Jesus. And although his writings are somewhat disputed as to whether they were embellished later on by other scribes, there are some parts of his writings that are undisputed, and from those we can get historical proof that Jesus was a real man. Josephus talks about James, who was seemingly a leader in the early Jerusalem church. And he says that James was actually a brother, or a stepbrother, we know, of Jesus. He says that Jesus was a wise and a virtuous man. He says that he was killed by Pontius Pilate, and that he had both Jews and Gentiles following him around, listening to him. Josephus writes that Jesus' apostles claimed he had risen from the dead on the third day, and they were now taking that good news to the world. Josephus says that it was possible that this man was the Messiah talked about in the Old Testament, and he says that some men called him the Messiah, even though it doesn't seem that Josephus believed fully that he was, because he never converted to Christianity. And so again, here we have a man who's not biased. He's not a follower of Christ, writing about and confirming the facts that the Bible tells us about this real historical man, Jesus. There are some other documents that also confirm that Jesus was real, and those actually come from his enemies. The Jews were certainly no fan of Jesus. They accused him of working for the devil, of being a blasphemer, and ultimately they caused him to be crucified. But their writings actually confirm his existence for us today. In the Babylonian Talmud, there are several references to a real historical man. The Talmud confirms that Jesus was hanged or crucified, hung on a cross, and that happened on the eve of the Passover. The Talmud then talks about how Jesus is actually a bad guy because he was trying to change the laws of the Jews, and that when he was put on trial for these accusations, nobody came and defended him. And so for us today, those serve as very valuable references to the fact that even though these people didn't like Jesus, they confirmed him historically. But here's another one for you to consider. There was a guy named Lucian, and Lucian was a satirist. And sometimes he's referred to as Lucian of Samosata. He lived in the 2nd century, and he was no fan of Christianity. In fact, he kind of was patronizing or liked to poke fun at these Christians. And he writes that Christians follow a well-known sophist. And this sophist was crucified because he was doing magic and tricking people in the land of Palestine. So again, here we have a man who's not a friend of Christianity, but yet confirms the historicity of Jesus, even saying that he was a well-known individual. Do you know the name Celsus? Celsus was a 2nd century writer and critic of Christianity, and he actually wrote one of the first criticisms of the Christian faith. He wrote a book called True Discourse in 178 AD, and in it he attacks Christians, but confirms that Christ was real. In his attempt to kind of undercut Christianity, he attacks its legitimacy by saying that Jesus was born into low circumstances. And we know that that's true, because even the Bible tells us that he was born to a poor family. He also says that Jesus was the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier. And this is really an attack on the fact that Jesus in the scriptures claimed to be virgin born, right? And so an easy attack would be to say, that's a lie. He was born illegitimately. He goes on to say that as Jesus grew up, he started to tell people that he was God, and that he deceived a lot of people that way. And eventually his own people, the Jews, turned on him and killed him. And then that there was a deception that he had resurrected from the dead. Celsus certainly isn't ready to accept Jesus as his Savior, but he does confirm for us the same facts that we find in the Bible. Not only that Jesus was a real man, but these specifics about his life. And one final one, there's a book called The Life of Pythagoras, written by a guy named Porphyry of Tyre, and he again mocks Jesus, saying, he was nothing special. In fact, he says the ancient magicians had greater power than Jesus did. And although he's not a believer, again, he confirms that Jesus was real, and he never denies that he was a historical figure. So, was Jesus real? Yes. The answer is yes. There's an abundance of evidence, and again, very, very few people who are actually informed on this issue will take the position that Christ never existed. It's almost an illusory position at this point. If someone tries to beat you over the head with that idea, it's probably because they haven't studied it too well. So, share this video if it's been helpful to you. Subscribe to the channel. This is kind of the foundation for apologetics, and I'd like to move into a little bit more apologetics than we have done in the past. So, this is probably the first place to start with anybody to prove that the Christian faith is a legitimate worldview for today. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share your comments down below, whether you agree or disagree. See you later.